In tonight's news edition, the king congratulates Palestinians during a visit to Ramallah on their achievement at the UN and reiterates Jordan's support. In Cairo, Egypt's Republican Guard orders demonstrators to leave the area around the presidential palace after fierce clashes kill 7 people. And fighting in Syria intensifies, and several Western countries issue coordinated warnings to Assad's government not to use chemical weapons. Good evening and welcome to the news at 10. His Majesty the King paid a visit to the West Bank and reiterated Jordan's solidarity with the Palestinians' aspirations for an independent and sovereign state. The king met Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas in the city of Ramallah and on behalf of the Jordanian people congratulated the Palestinians for their historic achievements of being granted the status of observer non-member state at the UN. This step, the king pointed out, reflects the extent of the international community's interest in the Palestinian cause and finding a just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution. His Majesty pledged that Jordan will pursue its support of the Palestinian Authority's efforts at world forums to realize Palestinian hopes for independence and setting up a state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. For that end, the king added he will work together with U.S. President Barack Obama at the start of his second term and ensure a swift, hands-on U.S. approach in the Middle East peace process. The king and Abbas agreed to continue coordination and consultations with the aim of restoring momentum to the peace process. The two leaders condemned Israel's latest move to build 3,000 housing units in Jewish settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, calling it an obstacle to peace efforts and an affront to the will of the international community. Abbas thanked Jordan for its relentless support of the Palestinian cause and commended the king's role in defending Palestine at international forums. Also in Ramallah, Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour met with his Palestinian counterpart Salam Fayyad and discussed means of forging closer cooperation in various fields. Meanwhile, Foreign Minister Nasser Joudeh and his Palestinian counterpart Riyad Malki held a press conference in Ramallah in which they highlighted the importance of the king's visit, which reflects his support of the Palestinians in their quest to establish an independent state. He added Jordan is concerned in final status issues, adding the king's visit, the first of its kind to Ramallah, provides an opportunity to hold more consultations and coordinations on future steps. Joudeh warned that Israeli plans to build on an area close to Jerusalem will split the West Bank into two, affecting any future Palestinian state.
The recent announcement from Israel about building more settlements, and especially in the sensitive area E1, will separate the West Bank into two sides. This will clearly affect the Palestinian state geographically. The settlement policy is unacceptable from us as the Jordanian Kingdom and as Arab and Muslims, and also from all over the world.
Maliki, for his part, said the king and Abbas saw eye to eye on various issues, mainly negotiations with Israel and Palestine's UN membership. He also thanked Jordan for its continued support to the Palestinians at all international forums. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour congratulated his Kuwaiti counterpart, Sheikh Jaber al-Mubarak al-Ahmad al-Sabah, over the success of the recent parliamentary elections and wished the Kuwaiti government further progress and prosperity. The Prime Minister voiced Jordan's keenness to boost relations and cooperation with the new Kuwaiti government. The Prime Minister also discussed with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon the Syrian crisis and its humanitarian and social impact on Jordan. Mansour highlighted the important role of the UN to find solutions for challenges facing the region and its people. The Prime Minister reviewed Jordan's efforts to provide services to more than 250,000 Syrian refugees, adding they place tremendous pressure on the kingdom's economy. Talks also covered the Palestinian issues, especially after the UN's decision last week to recognize Palestine as a de facto sovereign state. The UN chief hailed efforts of His Majesty the King to bring about peace and stability in the Middle East. He also valued Jordan's role to host Syrian refugees on its territory. Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour also discussed with UNHCR Special Envoy Angelina Jolie and its representatives in Jordan, Andrew Harper, the latest developments in Syria and their humanitarian impact on the kingdom. He said that Jordan will continue hosting Syrian refugees despite its economic and financial hardship as well as its limited resources. The Prime Minister added that the increasing number of Syrian refugees in the kingdom places pressure on the health and education sectors in Jordan. He urged Arab and friendly countries as well as concerned organizations to provide aid and support to the kingdom to enable it to continue its humanitarian services to the displaced Syrians. Jolie expressed her appreciation of Jordan's role in alleviating the suffering of Syrian refugees. She voiced her understanding to the extent of challenges facing Jordan as a result of hosting thousands of Syrian refugees on its territory. Clashes erupted in the West Bank city of Hebron as tensions escalate between Palestinians and Israelis. Young Palestinian men pelted the Israeli soldiers with stones, who in turn fired rounds of tear gas into the crowds. Hebron is usually caught in violence, where nearly 300,000 Palestinian residents live alongside some 500 Jewish settler families. German Chancellor Angela Merkel called on Israel to work on a two-state solution with the Palestinians and avoid unilateral action that endangers the peace prospects. Israel's plan to build 3,000 settler homes in one of the most sensitive areas of the West Bank has caused a storm of international protest and open criticism from Berlin. Palestinians say the new settlement could bisect the West Bank and cut them off from Jerusalem.
We believe that the work on the two-state solution needs to be continued from the German side, and we want a Jewish state of Israel as well as a Palestinian state. In our view, there must be continued attempts for negotiations, and one-sided measures must be avoided. This also leads to the fact that on the question of settlements, we agreed that we disagree.
I hope that we can engage at least part of the Palestinian people in a discussion about mutual coexistence, about mutual peace, about two states for two peoples, about a Jewish state living next to a Palestinian state, about security borders for Israel. This is our task. Now, I haven't given up on it, and I'll tell you the best proof that I haven't given up on that, and in trying to persuade fair-minded, decent people and decent leaders in Europe, the best proof that I believe that that is a worthwhile and achievable objective is the fact that I'm here. And we'll continue to work with Chancellor Merkel and with our government to see how we can advance this realistic peace. We don't give up so quickly on anything.
A car bomb went off at the headquarters for the Syrian Arab Red Crescent in the capital Damascus, killing at least one person and wounding many others. The Red Crescent has come under fire several times, and its representatives accuse both the government and Syrian rebels of the attack. There was also fighting near the Syrian-Lebanon border, where 3 men were killed by sniper fire in the Lebanese port city of Tripoli. The conflict is continuing to get worse, with bread shortages in some areas of Damascus and Aleppo. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will meet international Syrian mediator Lakhdar Brahimi in Dublin to try to put a UN peace process for Syria back on track. Syria's Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Maqdad said Western powers are raising fears of the use of chemical weapons in Syria's civil war as a pretext for intervention. He spoke as Germany's cabinet approved stationing Patriot anti-missile batteries on Turkey's border with Syria, a step requiring deployment of NATO troops that Syria fears could impose a no-fly zone over its territory. Hala Dababne has more in this report.
As fighting in Syria's 20-month civil war has intensified around the capital, several Western countries have issued coordinated warnings to Assad's government not to use chemical weapons. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon expressed deep concern over the possible use of Syrian chemical weapons. In a joint news conference with Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki in Baghdad, Moon said he had informed President Assad of his concerns. Speaking after meeting with Amir Sheikh Subah al-Ahmad al-Subah, the UN Secretary General said the ongoing violence in Syria, which had killed more than 40,000 people, was unacceptable and could not continue.
Unfortunately, the parties to this crisis, both Syrian government and opposition parties, seem to be just continuing to believe that military option may prevail. I again, repeatedly saying that the military option cannot be the solution to this. The violence must stop, first and foremost, immediately, without any condition.
Syrian opposition forces and Western intelligence officials have said that recent rebel advances in the Syrian conflict may provoke Assad to use chemical weapons, which he is widely believed to possess. The International Red Cross said the impact of possible chemical weapons used in Syria on aid efforts would be difficult to anticipate.
Our general assessment is that the conflict is expanding, that the ability to reach populations is not following at the same pace as the expanding conflict. So we have an increasing gap between needs emerging and abilities to cover those needs. But we, despite all the difficulties, we keep up an important humanitarian activities in Syria.
Syria's Deputy Foreign Minister Faisal Maqdad says he fears Western countries are voicing concerns of possible chemical weapons use in Syria in order to lay the ground for an intervention.
If Syria had chemical weapons, these weapons would definitely not be used against the people of Syria. We have strong fear of the existence of a conspiracy to use the weapons by the United States and some European states, which might have supplied such weapons to terrorist organizations in Syria in order to claim later that Syria is the one that used these weapons.
Maqdad spoke as NATO had decided to deploy Patriot missile batteries at Turkey's borders with Syria in order to augment Turkey's air defense capabilities. However, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said the missile deployment would be defensive only and would in no way support a no-fly zone or any offensive operation. Hala Dababne for the News at 10.
And from violence in Syria to violence in Lebanon, 3 men were killed by sniper fire in the Lebanese port city of Tripoli during sectarian clashes. 2 of those killed were from Jabal Muhsin and the 3rd from Bab al-Tabbane, but it was unclear if they were involved in the fighting. Residents in Tripoli said they have heard heavy gunfire overnight as soldiers tried to stop clashes. The army said 2 of its soldiers had been wounded and that it had arrested 5 men on suspicion of opening fire. 8 people have now been killed and 73 wounded in fighting in the city that started on Tuesday. Egypt's Republican Guard restored order around the presidential palace after fierce overnight clashes killed 7 people. But emotions ran high in a struggle over the country's future. President Mohamed Morsi, criticized by his opponents for his silence during the last few days, is due to address the nation later in the day. Leishan Qiti has the details.
Egypt's Republican Guard ordered rival demonstrators to leave the area around the presidential palace in Cairo after fierce overnight clashes that killed 7 people. The presidency announced that the Republican Guard, whose duties include protecting the palace, has set a 3 p.m. deadline for supporters and opponents of Morsi to quit an area they had turned into a battleground. A witness said that hundreds of Morsi supporters who had camped overnight near the palace perimeter left before the military deadline passed. Dozens of Morsi's foes remained but were kept away by a barbed wire barricade guarded by tanks. Morsi's Islamist partisans had fought opposition protesters well into the early morning hours during dueling demonstrations over the president's decision last month to expand his power to help him push through a mostly Islamist drafted constitution. Army officers on the spot urged the combatants to back off and stop the bloodshed that is further dividing Egypt and imperiling its quest for political stability and economic recovery nearly 2 years after mass protests overthrew Mubarak. Officials said 350 people had been wounded, as well as 7 killed. 6 of the dead were Morsi supporters. With at least 7 tanks at the palace corners, backed by about 10 armored troops carriers and 20 police trucks, the two sides mostly shouted slogans at each other from a distance. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, speaking from Dublin, urged Egyptians to settle their differences through dialogue.
The upheaval we are seeing once again in the streets of Cairo and other cities indicates that dialogue is urgently needed. And we call on all the stakeholders in Egypt to settle their differences through discussion and debate, not through violence. And we call on Egypt's leaders to ensure that the outcome protects the democratic promise of the revolution for all Egyptians.
The violence that had stretched from Wednesday afternoon into the early hours of this morning had abated and the streets were calm. Around the palace, traffic moved through streets strewn with rocks thrown during violence in which petrol bombs and guns were also used. Late Shankiti for the news at 10.
And the climate meeting continues in Doha. The European Union's promises of raising aid to help developing countries tackle climate change failed to unblock a deal at UN talks. The 2-week meeting, due to end tomorrow, reached a deadlock on modest goals such as aid and an extension of an existing UN-led plan to combat climate change. Negotiators drafted text to extend Kyoto Protocol but left a difficult choice of options to be decided as Russia, Japan and Canada have pulled out, saying it makes no sense to continue when big emerging nations led by China and India have no binding goals.
We are deeply concerned with the status of the negotiations as we find ourselves in right now. The first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol is ending in 25 days, but we really don't have 25 days. We have a few precious hours left, to ensure that we are on the right trajectory to addressing the climate crisis.
Barcelona's Lionel Messi was carried off on a stretcher after sustaining what the club said was bruising to his left knee near the end of the La Liga side's Champions League Group G match at home. The Argentine World Player of the Year collapsed to the ground, clutching the back of his knee after colliding with Benfica goalkeeper Artur, and looked to be in severe discomfort as he was taken from the pitch. Tests quickly ruled out anything worse than severe bruising, and Messi appeared relaxed and smiling for a news conference. He said that he too had feared the worst in the collision. The game ended 0-0 with Barca already through to the last 16 as group winners and Benfica forced to settle for a place in the Europa League. And finally to the weather outlook. Cold and partly cloudy weather tonight with light rain and southwesterly moderate winds. Tomorrow, relatively cold in hilly areas and fair in other regions. Rain is also expected in the northern regions in the evening, gradually extending to the central parts of the kingdom. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect fair weather tomorrow with southerly moderate winds and calm seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To end the news, here's a reminder of our top stories. The King congratulates Palestinians during a visit to Ramallah on their achievement at the UN and reiterates Jordan's support. In Cairo, Egypt's Republican Guard orders demonstrators to leave the area around the presidential palace after fierce clashes killed 7 people. And fighting in Syria intensifies, and several Western countries issue coordinated warnings to Assad's government not to use chemical weapons. With that, we come to the end of tonight's news. I'm Nancy Khair. Thank you for watching and have a good night.